In the depths of an Austrian lake, beneath 300 feet of black water, lies one of history's most enduring mysteries. Lake Toplitz, a name that sends chills down the spines of treasure hunters and historians alike. Here, in the final desperate days of the Third Reich, Nazi SS officers dumped crates upon crates of secrets into the murky abyss. Gold bars, stolen artwork, classified documents. And perhaps the most valuable treasure of all, the truth about Hitler's final plan for over 75 years. This remote alpine lake has guarded its secrets jealously. Divers have died trying to reach its depths. Governments have launched covert operations. Fortune seekers have risked everything for just a glimpse of what the Nazis tried so desperately to hide. But what if I told you that the real treasure isn't gold at all? What if the most dangerous secret sleeping beneath these waters could rewrite everything we thought we knew about the end of World War II? If you're ready to dive into one of history's most compelling mysteries, a story of greed, betrayal, and deadly obsession, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to discover will change how you see the final chapter of the Nazi regime forever. Welcome to the hunt for Hitler's lost gold. The date was May 8, 1945, as church bells rang across Europe celebrating Victory Day. A convoy of unmarked trucks wound through the treacherous mountain roads of the Austrian Alps under cover of darkness. These weren't fleeing Nazi officials, they were something far more sinister. SS Oberführer August Könenberg led this final desperate mission, his pale hands gripping classified orders that bore the personal seal of Heinrich Himmler himself. The trucks carried more than just the remnants of the Third Reich's plundered wealth. Inside, reinforced steel crates lay documents so explosive they could topple governments. Evidence of war crimes that reached into the highest echelons of Allied command, and financial records that would expose a web of collaboration between Nazi Germany and neutral nations that persists to this day. Lake Toplitz stretched before them like a black mirror, its surface reflecting the dying embers of Hitler's empire. This wasn't a random choice. The lake's unique properties made it the perfect tomb for secrets. Fed by underground springs and lacking oxygen below 60 feet, Toplitz was a natural preservation chamber where nothing decomposed, nothing rotted, and nothing ever truly died. Könenberg had studied the lake's depths obsessively. At 300 feet deep, with near-freezing temperatures year-round, it was virtually inaccessible to conventional diving equipment of the era. More importantly, the lake's floor was covered in a thick layer of prehistoric silt that would swallow whatever sank into it, hiding evidence for decades, perhaps centuries. As his men began the systematic dumping of crate after crate, Könenberg clutched a leather satchel that never left his side. Inside were the crown jewels of Nazi intelligence, Operation Bernhard counterfeiting plates, the complete membership roster of American and British Nazi sympathizers, and most shocking of all, evidence of a secret pact between high-ranking SS officers and Allied intelligence agencies, a deal that would allow certain war criminals to escape justice in exchange for their cooperation against the Soviet Union. The local Austrian resistance had been watching. Hidden in the dense pine forests surrounding the lake, Johann Huber and his small band of fighters documented every truck, every crate, every face. They knew this wasn't just about gold. This was about power, about control, about ensuring that certain truths would never see daylight. But Huber made a fatal mistake. In his eagerness to document the Nazi operation, he got too close. A snapped twig, a startled bird, and suddenly the forest erupted in gunfire. 2 of his men fell immediately, their blood staining the pristine alpine snow. Huber himself took a bullet in the shoulder, but managed to escape with his camera intact. Carrying photographic evidence that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Könenberg's operation continued through the night. Crate after crate disappeared beneath Toplitz's surface with barely a splash. Gold bars worth millions in today's currency, stolen masterpieces that belonged in museums, and documents that could destabilize entire governments, all swallowed by the hungry depths. As dawn approached, Kronenberg performed one final chilling ritual. He opened his personal satchel and removed a small wooden box, ornately carved with Nazi symbols. Inside, wrapped in waterproof oilskin, were Hitler's personal journals from his final weeks in the bunker, pages that revealed not just his mental state, but detailed plans for a Fourth Reich, complete with hidden funding mechanisms, sleeper cells, and a timeline that extended decades into the future. The box sank into the darkness, carrying with it the Führer's final, most dangerous legacy. But as Kronenberg's convoy disappeared into the morning mist, Johann Huber was already developing his photographs in a hidden darkroom, unaware that he had just captured evidence of what would become the most sought-after treasure in modern history. He had no idea that his photographs would soon make him the most hunted man in Austria, or that the secret he carried would cost him everything he held dear. 6 months after the war ended, Johann Huber's hands still trembled when he handled the photographs. The images were grainy, taken in desperate conditions, but they clearly showed Nazi officers dumping crates into Lake Toplitz. What Huber didn't know was that American intelligence had been watching him just as carefully as he had watched the Nazis. Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, had received fragmentary reports about Nazi treasure dumps across Austria. But Huber's photographs were the first concrete evidence of a systematic operation. In a smoke-filled room at OSS headquarters in Vienna, Donovan studied the images with growing excitement and dread. The implications were staggering. If the Nazis had hidden evidence of Allied collaboration, it could destroy the moral authority America needed for the emerging Cold War. Donovan's decision was swift and ruthless. Huber had to be eliminated and the lake had to be secured. But when OSS agents arrived at Huber's modest farmhouse outside Salzburg, they found only blood-soaked floorboards and signs of a violent struggle. Someone had beaten them to it. The truth was even more sinister. Huber had been betrayed by his own government. The newly formed Austrian authorities, desperate to distance themselves from their Nazi past, had struck a devil's bargain with surviving SS networks. In exchange for information about hidden Nazi assets, they would eliminate inconvenient witnesses like Huber. Franz Müller, a former SS Oberführer who had seamlessly transitioned into Austria's new intelligence service, personally oversaw Huber's interrogation in a basement cell beneath Vienna's City Hall. For 3 days, they tortured the resistance fighter, demanding not just his photographs, but every detail of what he had witnessed at the lake. Huber finally broke on the 3rd day, screaming through bloodied lips about the wooden box, about Kronenberg's final ritual, about documents that could bring down governments. But even as he revealed everything, Huber had held back one crucial detail. He had made copies of the photographs, hidden in a place only his daughter Maria would know to look. Müller executed Huber personally, a single bullet to the back of the head in the pre-dawn darkness of November 15th, 1945. But as Huber's body was dumped in an unmarked grave, Maria was already fleeing Austria with her father's legacy hidden in the false bottom of a battered suitcase. Meanwhile, the first official expedition to Lake Toplitz was being planned in secret. The U.S. Army's 430th Counterintelligence Corps unit, working in conjunction with British Special Operations executive remnants, assembled a diving team unlike any the world had ever seen. Led by Commander James "Shark" Patterson, a legendary Navy diver who had survived Normandy, the team included safecrackers, document specialists, and men whose official records had been mysteriously erased. The expedition launched under the cover story of geological research in the spring of 1946. Local Austrian officials were paid handsomely to look the other way, and a perimeter was established around the entire lake. What happened during those 3 weeks remains classified to this day, but witness accounts from nearby villagers paint a disturbing picture. Strange lights were seen beneath the water at night. Military trucks arrived and departed under heavy guard. Most chilling of all, several expedition members were quietly transferred to psychiatric facilities after suffering what their reports described as acute psychological trauma from unknown causes. Commander Patterson himself disappeared entirely. His official record states he died in a training accident months later. But Maria Huber, now living under an assumed identity in Switzerland, received a letter postmarked from Argentina in 1947. Inside was a photograph of Lake Toplitz and a single, terrifying sentence. "The box is still down there, and it's not the only one." As the Allied expedition packed up and departed, they left behind something far more dangerous than Nazi gold. They left behind witnesses, secrets, and a growing obsession that would consume lives for decades to come. Because what they found in those depths wasn't just treasure. It was proof that some secrets were worth killing for, again and again. The year 1959 marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Toplitz madness. Jacques Cousteau himself had declared the lake impossible to dive, but that only attracted more treasure hunters. The first to die was Hans Fricke, a former Wehrmacht engineer who claimed he had helped design the waterproof containers used by the SS. Fricke's obsession began when he encountered Maria Huber in a Geneva cafe. She'd been living quietly as a translator, but the weight of her father's secret had been eating away at her for 14 years. In a moment of weakness, fueled by too much wine and too many sleepless nights, she showed Fricke the copied photographs. The images hit Fricke like a physical blow. He recognized the containers immediately, Type 7 pressure seals designed to withstand depths of up to 400 feet. More importantly, he recognized the man overseeing the operation, August Kronenberg, his former commanding officer. But Fricke knew something that would have chilled Maria's blood. Kronenberg hadn't died in 1945. He was alive, living under an assumed name in South America, and he had been quietly funding expeditions to recover what he had hidden. Fricke's first dive into Lake Toplitz was methodical and professional. Using equipment borrowed from Swiss geological surveys, he descended alone into the black water on a frigid October morning. At 200 feet, his diving light illuminated something that made his heart race, scattered metal fragments that looked disturbingly like crate hinges. But as Fricke descended further, something went catastrophically wrong. His airline became entangled in what his diving log described as unnatural formations on the lake floor. Desperate to free himself, he made the fatal mistake of ascending too quickly. When Austrian authorities pulled his body from the lake 3 days later, the autopsy revealed massive decompression injuries and something else that was never reported publicly. Fricke's diving suit had been slashed with a sharp instrument. The cuts were too precise, too deliberate to be accidental damage from debris. Someone or something had murdered Hans Fricke 250 feet beneath the surface of Lake Toplitz. The secret died with him, but not the obsession. Word of Fricke's discovery leaked through Europe's treasure-hunting community like wildfire. By 1961, Lake Toplitz had become a magnet for fortune seekers, conspiracy theorists, and increasingly dangerous expeditions. The most ambitious attempt came from an unlikely source, Hollywood producer Mel Stewart, who would later direct Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Stewart had become obsessed with Nazi treasure stories and saw Toplitz as the ultimate documentary subject. His 1963 expedition was equipped with state-of-the-art underwater cameras and professional diving teams. What Stewart's cameras captured was never meant for public viewing. At 280 feet, his divers found not just scattered debris, but what appeared to be an entire underwater graveyard. Dozens of metal containers lay half-buried in the silt, but disturbing them proved deadly. The first diver to attempt opening a container was found floating face down the next morning, his diving equipment intact, but his body showing signs of severe chemical burns. Stewart's team doctor, examining the body in secret, made a discovery that terrified him into silence. The burns weren't from acid or conventional chemicals. They matched exposure patterns from experimental Nazi nerve agents that officially had never been deployed. Someone had weaponized the treasure site, turning it into a deadly trap for anyone who got too close. As Stuart's expedition hastily departed Austria, they left behind more than just equipment. They left behind footage that would later be seized by government agents, testimonies that would be classified for decades, and a growing realization that Lake Toplitz wasn't just hiding treasure, it was hiding evidence of war crimes so profound that powerful forces would kill to keep them secret. But the deadliest revelation was yet to come. In Buenos Aires, August Könenberg read about Stuart's expedition in the newspaper and smiled coldly. His patience had been rewarded. After 18 years of waiting, someone had finally triggered his ultimate failsafe. The real hunt for Hitler's gold was about to begin, and this time Könenberg would be ready for them. August Könenberg's villa in the hills above Buenos Aires was a fortress disguised as a paradise. Palm trees swayed in manicured gardens, while armed guards patrolled behind decorative walls. But in his private study, surrounded by Nazi memorabilia that officially didn't exist, Könenberg was planning his return to Austria with the methodical precision that had once made him Himmler's most trusted operative. The news of Stuart's expedition had reached him through carefully maintained networks, former SS officers who had scattered across South America but never truly disbanded. They had been watching Lake Toplitz for decades, eliminating threats and protecting their secret with ruthless efficiency. Now Könenberg realized the time for passive protection was over. In October 1963, a mysterious Austrian businessman named Heinrich Wulff began purchasing diving equipment and recruiting personnel for what he described as a geological survey of alpine lakes. In reality, Könenberg had returned to reclaim what he had hidden 18 years earlier. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't the only one with deadly intentions. The CIA had been monitoring South American Nazi networks since 1947, and Könenberg's sudden movement triggered alarms at the highest levels of American intelligence. Operation Paperclip, which had secretly recruited Nazi scientists for the Cold War, had created a moral compromise that haunted the agency. If Könenberg recovered evidence of American collaboration with war criminals, it could destroy the United States' credibility in the ongoing struggle against the Soviet Union. Agent Sarah Mitchell, one of the CIA's few female operatives, was tasked with neutralizing the threat. Her cover as a freelance journalist investigating Nazi treasure hunters gave her perfect access to the growing circus around Lake Toplitz. But Mitchell quickly discovered that the situation was far more complex and dangerous than her briefings had suggested. Local Austrian authorities weren't just corrupt, they were actively participating in a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of government. The man they knew as Heinrich Wulff had been paying substantial bribes to ensure his expedition proceeded without interference. More disturbing, Mitchell's surveillance revealed that several Austrian officials were themselves former Nazi collaborators who had survived the war by destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses. The deadly game reached its climax in November 1963, when 3 separate expeditions converged on Lake Toplitz simultaneously. Könenberg's team arrived with military-grade diving equipment and enough firepower to outfit a small army. Mitchell's CIA unit masqueraded as a documentary crew, complete with underwater cameras and professional diving specialists. But the third group was the most dangerous of all. Surviving members of Johann Huber's resistance cell, led by his daughter Maria, who had spent 18 years planning her revenge. What none of them realized was that the lake itself had become a killing field. The chemical weapons that had claimed Stuart's diver weren't the only trap Könenberg had left behind in 1945. Pressure-sensitive mines, triggered by disturbance of the lake floor, had claimed the lives of at least a dozen treasure hunters over the years. The Austrian government had covered up each death, attributing them to diving accidents or equipment failures. On November 22nd, the same day, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The three expeditions finally encountered each other in the frigid waters of Lake Toplitz. What happened next was an underwater battle unlike anything in recorded history. Kronenberg's divers, trained killers who had perfected their techniques in the death camps, faced off against CIA operatives and Austrian resistance fighters in a three-way conflict 250 feet beneath the surface. Maria Huber was the first to die, shot through the chest by one of Kronenberg's men as she attempted to photograph the wooden box her father had died trying to expose. Her blood clouded the water, mixing with the silt and debris that had accumulated for decades. But as she sank toward the lake floor, Maria managed one final act of defiance. She triggered a phosphorus flare that illuminated the entire underwater graveyard, revealing a sight that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The lake floor wasn't just littered with Nazi containers, it was carpeted with human remains, the bones of hundreds of victims who had been murdered and dumped alongside the treasure, ensuring their silence for eternity. The phosphorus flare that Maria Huber ignited in her dying moments transformed Lake Toplitz into a hellscape of ghostly light and swirling bone fragments. CIA agent Sarah Mitchell, watching through her diving mask in horror, realized she was swimming through the largest unmarked grave in Austrian history. The skeletons weren't just random victims. Many wore the tattered remnants of concentration camp uniforms, evidence of a final atrocity that Kronenberg had orchestrated in the war's closing days. But the most chilling discovery lay deeper in the silt. Mixed among the human remains were smaller skeletons. Children, some no more than 5 or 6 years old. These weren't just witnesses to Nazi crimes. They were the offspring of SS officers and local women, murdered to prevent future blackmail and ensure absolute secrecy. Kronenberg had literally buried his past beneath hundreds of innocent lives. The underwater battle continued with savage intensity. Kronenberg's divers, using modified spear guns and underwater explosives, systematically hunted the CIA team through the forest of bones. Agent Mitchell found herself trapped behind a pile of corroded containers, her air supply dwindling as bullets streaked through the water around her. One of her team members, rookie agent James Parker, had his airline severed and drowned slowly while she watched helplessly, his final screams echoing through her communications gear. Above the surface, Austrian police had finally arrived, but they weren't there to help. Inspector Klaus Brenner, a man whose SS tattoo had been surgically removed years earlier, was coordinating with Kronenberg's surface team to eliminate any survivors who might surface with evidence. The lake had become a killing ground where the past and present merged in a symphony of violence. Mitchell's salvation came from an unexpected source. Hans Weber, an elderly Austrian, who had been secretly documenting treasure hunting attempts for decades, arrived with a boat full of explosive charges. Weber's son had been one of the children murdered by Kronenberg in 1945, and he had spent his entire adult life planning this moment of reckoning, as Kronenberg himself descended into the depths, weighted down by diving gear worth more than most people's homes. Weber began systematically detonating charges around the lake's perimeter. The underwater shockwaves created chaos in the depths, but they also dislodged something that had been buried for 18 years. Kronenberg's wooden box, Hitler's final testament, rising from the silt like a malevolent spirit. Kronenberg saw the box floating toward him and reached out with trembling hands, finally grasping the artifact that had haunted his dreams for decades. But as he opened the waterproof seal, his triumph turned to horror. The documents inside weren't Hitler's journals. They were detailed records of Kronenberg's own war crimes, compiled by Himmler as insurance against betrayal. Every murder, every atrocity, every moment of unspeakable evil was documented with Germanic precision. The real Hitler documents had never been in the lake at all. They were safely hidden in Switzerland, in a vault controlled by the International Red Cross, the ultimate insurance policy that had kept certain Nazi networks alive and funded for decades. Könenberg had been guarding nothing more than evidence of his own damnation. Sarah Mitchell, her oxygen nearly exhausted, made a desperate gambit. Using her last explosive charge, she triggered a controlled collapse of the lake's underwater shelf, creating an avalanche of silt and debris that buried most of the evidence forever. As she rocketed toward the surface, Könenberg was trapped beneath tons of sediment, still clutching the documents that sealed his fate. But Mitchell's victory was hollow. As she broke the surface, gasping for air in the frigid November wind, Inspector Brenner was waiting with a rifle. The Austrian government's conspiracy ran deeper than anyone had imagined, and there could be no witnesses to what had transpired in the depths of Lake Toplitz, the trigger pull that would silence Sarah. Mitchell forever was interrupted by a sound that chilled every man present to the bubbling scream of August Könenberg, still alive beneath 300 feet of water and sediment, slowly drowning in the graveyard he had created. The screams from beneath Lake Toplitz continued for 17 minutes before falling silent forever. Inspector Brenner's finger had frozen on the trigger, paralyzed by the inhuman sound echoing from the depths. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah Mitchell dove back beneath the surface, not to save Könenberg, but to retrieve the one, a piece of evidence that could expose the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. The documents Könenberg had clutched in his final moments weren't just records of his crimes. They contained bank account numbers, safe house locations, and most damning of all, a complete roster of Nazi collaborators who had infiltrated post-war governments across Europe and South America. Names that would shake the foundations of the Cold War alliance. Men who had traded their souls for power and had spent decades eliminating anyone who threatened their secret. Mitchell surfaced with the waterlogged papers just as Hans Weber's final explosive charge detonated. The shockwave shattered windows in villages 5 miles away and triggered an avalanche that sealed Lake Toplitz under millions of tons of rock and debris. Whatever else lay in those depths, the gold, the art, the remaining victims, would stay buried forever. But Weber's sacrifice had given Mitchell the window she needed. As Inspector Brenner raised his rifle again, she was already disappearing into the dense alpine forest, carrying evidence that would topple governments and expose the greatest cover-up in modern history. Or so she believed. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. The CIA had never intended for Mitchell to survive. Her mission had been designed as a one-way operation, meant to eliminate both Könenberg and any evidence of American collaboration with Nazi war criminals. The documents she had recovered were genuine, but they told only part of the story, the part that powerful men wanted revealed, hidden within the Vatican's secret archives. In a vault, accessible only to the Pope and 3 cardinals, lay the real Hitler Testament. Not ravings about a Fourth Reich, but detailed instructions for something called Operation Phoenix, a systematic plan to infiltrate democratic governments worldwide using survivors of the Nazi regime as sleeper agents. The operation hadn't ended with Germany's surrender. It had simply gone underground, funded by stolen Jewish gold and protected by men who found fascism more profitable than freedom. Sarah Mitchell never made it out of Austria. Her body was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, apparently the victim of a climbing accident. The documents she died protecting were returned to their rightful custodians, men who had spent decades ensuring that certain truths would never see daylight. Hans Weber's grandson, Klaus, inherited more than just his family's tragic history. Hidden in his grandfather's workshop was a metal container pulled from Lake Toplitz years earlier, before the Austrian government had declared the area off-limits. Inside were photographs, documents, and physical evidence that told a story even more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The gold that treasure hunters had died seeking was real, but it was never the primary objective. The lake had served as a disposal site for evidence of medical experiments conducted on prisoners of war, Allied prisoners. American, British and Soviet soldiers had been subjected to chemical weapons testing, psychological torture, and surgical procedures that violated every principle of human decency. The resulting data had been traded to Allied intelligence agencies in exchange for new identities and safe passage to South America. Klaus Weber faced the same choice that had consumed his grandfather's generation: expose the truth and face certain death, or remain silent and let the victims rest in anonymous graves. He chose a third option, one that would have terrified the conspirators who thought they had buried their crimes forever. In 2019, using modern deep-sea diving technology and underwater robotics, Klaus Weber launched an unauthorized expedition to what remained accessible of Lake Toplitz. The avalanche had sealed most of the lake, but thermal imaging revealed cavities in the debris field where water still flowed. Working in complete secrecy, Weber's team recovered fragments of documents, personal effects and, most importantly, photographic evidence that had been sealed in waterproof containers for over 70 years. The images were grainy, damaged by decades underwater, but they clearly showed Allied soldiers in Nazi custody, subjected to experiments that would later form the foundation of psychological warfare programs used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The moral complexity was staggering. Allied intelligence agencies had not just recruited Nazi war criminals. They had adopted their methods and incorporated their research into ongoing operations. Klaus Weber published his findings on December 7, 2019, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The response was swift and predictable. Government agencies across 3 continents launched investigations into fraudulent archaeological claims. Weber's academic credentials were questioned, his mental health examined, his financial records scrutinized for evidence of foreign influence. But the internet had changed the rules of the game. Weber's evidence spread faster than any government could contain it, spawning investigations, documentaries, and legal challenges that continue to this day. The families of Allied soldiers began demanding answers. Holocaust survivors recognized the medical procedures described in the documents. International courts opened inquiries into war crimes that had never been prosecuted. The hunt for Hitler's lost gold had finally ended, not with treasure recovered, but with truth revealed. The real gold had never been in the lake. It had been in Swiss banks all along, funding a conspiracy that had shaped the post-war world in ways historians are still discovering. Lake Toplitz remains sealed, its deepest secrets protected by tons of rock and decades of official denial. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like bodies in water, rising despite every effort to keep it buried. The men who died protecting these secrets took their guilt to unmarked graves. But their crimes live on in classified files, in victim testimonies, and in the patient work of researchers who refuse to let history lie. The next time you hear about Nazi gold, remember this: the most valuable treasure isn't always silver and precious stones. Sometimes it's truth, buried so deep that men will kill to keep it hidden and die to bring it to light. What other secrets do you think remain buried in the depths of history? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe if you want to explore more of the hidden truths that shaped our world. Because every mystery solved reveals 10 more waiting in the darkness.